Hello and welcome back. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a galaxy or a northern lights background with a supply that you likely already have. We're going to use some dye-based markers. I have a galaxy marker set from Tombow, so I'm using Tombow markers. I added a chartreuse color. I'll post the colors down below that I am using because the set that I found to link down below has different colors than the galaxy set that I have, but both sets will work. So I'm going to randomly scribble on the piece of this watercolor paper. You do need to use watercolor paper for this. We're going to be using some water after this to make the inks run, and regular cardstock is not going to run properly for what we need to do. It's just going to bubble and warp. So there's not really a rhyme or reason for how I'm putting the marker on here. What I'm trying to do, and I'm doing the Galaxy one right now, is I'm trying to get the lighter colors, the more blue colors in the center, and I'm putting the darker ones, the purples, the blacks, towards the outside so that I have a little bit of a frame. If when you do this you don't get a frame, I'll show you once our piece is dry how to add a frame around it. And by frame I just mean make it darker around the edges so that it looks like you're looking into a galaxy. So I'm using the darkest color that's in this set, and it's really a dark gray, it's not actually a black, and I'm just coloring all the way around the edges and just filling in a few little spots. So that's all I really need for that piece. For the one on the right is the one I'm doing the Northern Lights piece. I'm using the chartreuse color, which is the color I added as well as the galaxy set. I really like the way this almost turns into a fluorescent green when you add water to it. And now I'm adding one of the turquoisey colors, and then the hot pink. And that's pretty much all the colors that I'm using for the Northern Lights part. The rest is going to be filled in with some of the blues so that I have a little bit of a night sky. And once again, if some of these pieces end up being a little bit too light, I'll show you after it's dry how we're going to darken some of the edges for that. So just so I did for the piece on the left, I'm completely covering the whole piece of watercolor cardstock. And by that, it doesn't need to be completely covered. You can see some pieces of watercolor cardstock through that, but I am putting color over the whole piece. I'm not leaving anything in particular just plain. Once you've got your colors how you want them, I'm going to use a misting bottle to mist water all over it and help the inks to run. Now before I actually put the water on the pieces that I've colored, I'm going to mist my mat and then put those pieces of watercolor cardstock over top of that. What that does is it helps the cardstock from warping and bending, and it kind of helps keep it in place, kind of suctions it almost in place. When you do this, it does make it take a little bit longer to dry, but I think it's worth it knowing that you have a little bit more control over how the inks blend and flow. If you don't do this and don't put the water underneath, your paper curls, and then the water or the liquid or the dye just flows to the lowest point. So you lose a little bit of control. Once you have as much water as you want on there, just let it dry. Now, I haven't done it for any of these pieces, but if you want, you could take a watercolor brush and manipulate your ink a little bit if you want it in a certain area. So now I've got some chipped Sapphire Distress ink. I'm using a jumbo dauber, and I'm just going to ink around the edges where I want that blue to be a little bit darker and kind of frame the image in. I'm tapping the dauber in the ink pad frequently to get more ink on it, and I'm starting off of my image piece on my mat, and I'm working in a circular motion onto the image piece. So there is a little bit of a lip for the cardstock, so you don't want to press too hard, otherwise you might bend your paper. So just a light touch. You can always add more ink, but if you've bent your paper, you can't really unbend it. Sometimes it doesn't matter, sometimes it does. So for the one on the left, I'm using a black ink and doing the same motion. I'm starting off of my piece, and I'm just gently adding ink to it. You can also lift your paper up and get a darker edge around it. By lifting it up, you have a little bit more control that way. So I'm doing both methods. I'm adding the darker color by lifting it up, and I'm also keeping my piece of paper on my surface and using a circular motion just to blend it in a little bit more. When you lift it up and do it that way, you have more of a, it's darker, but it's a smaller area that gets inked. By having your piece of paper on the surface, on your work surface, and doing the circular motion like I'm doing here, you end up with a better blend or better fade into your image. So you just keep doing this until you're satisfied with how much has been inked. Once you're happy with how much has been inked, the next step is to add a little bit of stars, which makes it a little bit more interesting. So I have some gold acrylic paint that I'm going to use for this. You could also use silver, you could also use white. And I'm using a Tim Holtz splatter brush as well. Rather than using the acrylic paint exactly how it is, I'm adding a little bit of water just to thin it out a little bit, just to have a little bit more control. This particular paint is quite thick and heavy, and I want it to be a little bit lighter to be able to splatter it nicely. I love this splatter brush because it pretty much splatters exactly where it's directed rather than splattering away. When you use a toothbrush, you kind of get a bit of a spray pattern. This is a little bit more delicate, and to me it looks a little bit more like stars. And you may have noticed I did test it on my work surface first before actually doing it on my piece. I just wanted to make sure that I had a good consistency with the paint and I wasn't going to get some big blobs there. I'm also going to add some to the Northern Lights piece. I do want to have a little bit of stars in the sky there. Not all of them are going to show up because a lot of that color is going to hide the gold splatters, but I still like it on there. Once you have as many splatters as you want, you need to set it aside to dry again. It's not going to take as long to dry as it did for the water, but you do need to make sure it's 100% dry before you put in your cards together. So I've chosen mats to go around my pieces, and I'm just doing them on a 5x7 card base. I'm going to glue my mats in place with some Distress Collage medium. I love the Distress Collage medium because it is matte and it also is completely clear. So if some of that glue happens to seep out, you're not going to see it at all. And I really quite like that feature. I also like using a liquid glue so that I can shift and shimmy things into place if by chance it happens to move on me. Now the cardstock, the watercolor cardstock has warped a little bit from the liquid, so I'm using an acrylic block and a jar with some glass beads in it just to weigh it down and let it dry for a minute before I put the sentiment on the front. And while that's drying, I'm going to put the pieces on for the Northern Lights piece. So I have a black mat here. I'll have the sizes of each of these pieces written in the description below. I'm going to put that mat down, make sure it is in place exactly how I want it, and now I'm gluing my watercolor cardstock piece in the same way as the first one. You'll see this one slips on me in a moment, and it's just easy to put it in place. That's why I like the liquid glue. So for this Northern Lights one, I wanted it to look like it was above a forest. So I have some tree die cuts that I'm going to be gluing down at the bottom. And I had planned on gluing it to the Northern Lights piece first and then cutting it down, but forgot to do that. So before gluing those trees down, you want to make sure to cut them to the right size. And by laying them down and just seeing where you want your piece to end, that's the easiest way to do it. Now the cardstock that I'm actually using for this is a piece of color core cardstock that I happen to have left. So you'll see green on one side, but the part that is going to be glued or that's going to be facing you when you see your card is black. Obviously just regular cardstock will work. I'm just using some scraps that I happen to have. Now I wanted to give my layer of trees a little bit more dimension, so I actually cut it twice, and I'll lay it down the second time, making sure that I don't have a repeat pattern. I want it to look like a bunch of natural trees and not a repeat pattern. So it's nice that the tree line die cut is longer than what I actually need, so then I can control what is seen. So you'll see me cut the edges of it that I don't need, and then I'll glue it down, same as the first one. And I did cut it a little bit shorter for the second layer as well, so that you still see the other layer behind it. Once those trees are glued down, I will use the acrylic block and the jar of glass beads to hold it in place while I'm adding the sentiment to my galaxy card. So I just have a die cut that says Imagine for my galaxy piece. There are a bunch of different stamp sets or stencils out there that are constellations and stuff like that that would look awesome on this card as well. I just don't happen to have any, so I worked with what I had. So this is just a white die cut. It's going to bring out some of the stars there, and it's going to brighten up the piece as well. This particular die cut set also has one that says Dream, which would also be appropriate for this card in my opinion. So I'm just gluing that down using the same Distress Collage medium. And that is how the card looks when it's done. And then this is how the Northern Lights one looks. I love how that green went kind of fluorescent-y. Here are the cards together, a little bit of a closer look. Thank you so much for spending your time with me and watching. Please hit subscribe and the like button. I really appreciate it. Have a fabulous day.